All right. Thanks, everyone, for coming this afternoon for this conversation with Kat Taylor. Ms. Taylor is the CEO of Beneficial State Bank, which is a community-based bank in Oakland that's focused on bringing beneficial banking practices to underserved communities, in addition to developing economically and environmentally sustainable lending practices. On top of her work at Beneficial State Bank, Ms. Taylor, along with her husband, Tom Steyer, is involved with a number of leading progressive initiatives, including battling climate change, developing sustainable agricultural practices, and addressing some of the issues at the federal level dealing with the guy in the White House. So with that, I'll turn it over to Ms. Taylor, and here we go.
Thank you very much. Maybe I have to, am I coming through as a mic'd person, or, oh wait. Now I might be, right? Okay, thanks. So I thank you very much for this opportunity. I love talking about banking. I love talking about banking even more to people who are interested in it. Banking is super important, but you know it's boring and complicated, so a lot of people don't really want to deal with it. But it might be one of the most important decisions we make in our life. It's important that we choose the right yogurt and recycle and do all sorts of other things, but your banking choice really drives huge societal outcomes, and that's obscured from most people who are just keeping their head down and trying to get through the day and take care of their families and so on. So I consider you all evangelists, and you'll be out there telling people to wake up to the power of their banking and to align it with their values. I came from a need to impeach town hall that my husband hosted in Glendale in Los Angeles last night. And I can tell you the citizen outrage and activism is at an all-time high since the failure to release the Mueller report. And it was a very picante event. So I'm going to start with a tiny song. They say that these are not the best of times, but they're the only times I'll ever know. And I believe there is a time for meditation in cathedrals of our own. So when I see that sad surrender in my brother's eyes, I can't stand aside and only sympathize. For we are always what our situation hands us. May all roads lead to a new president. So I'm really proud to represent Beneficial State Bank, which is headquartered in Oakland, California, serves the 3 West Coast states, $1 billion in assets, 17 branch offices, powered by 250 wonderful colleagues. We're a small bank in the system, but we've just gotten to the point where we're big enough to say we can prove that a triple bottom line model of banking works, and we can try to influence the greater system. So we are now changing our mission to changing the banking system for good. Banking belongs to all of us, but hardly anybody knows it. We actually think of banking as the original and most powerful form of crowdfunding, much like Kickstarter, Indiegogo, etc. We pool our idle cash, called deposits, into the banking system. We gave that banking system tremendous prerogatives in order to finance the future in which we all wish to live. It's not that a single deposit funds a single loan, you all know that, but every deposit funds a lending practice, and that's the most powerful thing a bank does. And it should be sustaining local living economies and the communities who depend upon that. But it has not been. In spite of massive regulatory effort in DoddFrank, in the CFPB, in continuing efforts to stem deregulation by the Trump administration, banking has been dragging this horrible train of misery behind it. So we actually need the banking system to stop doing harm even before we ask it to produce benefits. And those harms include, this is a dated slide. I think in the first 7 years of the financial crisis, about $380 billion of fines were paid by the biggest banks, and that meant nothing to change behavior. Because honestly, that's just a cost of doing business. These are the most profitable companies in the world. They could lose $380 billion in their car of an afternoon and not miss it. B of A had a $4 billion capital account error ride its balance sheet for 1 year without its internal or external audits noticing it. And in fact, it's not surprising that they didn't notice it because B of A is now well on to $2.5 trillion in assets. So that really is an error term. It did cancel their dividend. It did put their regulators on notice that we actually can't manage organizations that big. The Veterans Administration is $69 billion in assets, and it's having a hard time. So these banks are just massive, marauding, ancient dinosaurs lurching around the landscape, and they managed to lose us nearly 5 million homes in the financial meltdown. Most of those homes affected the wealth of people of color disproportionately. At the same time, these banks were making record-level profits and surviving the meltdown through bailouts, which we should never have given them, but we had to because they were system-size risk. 1/3 of their tellers were having to take some form of public assistance. They simply can't find a way to pay their tellers enough to live. And mostly what they do is they offer them very, very part-time, unpredictable hours. They say come in at 10, the lobby clears at 2, they say go home now. They never hit 30 hours to receive benefits. I have some updated figures that will just curl your hair about Chase Bank, but even in the last 10 years, the banks altogether provided at least $250 billion of finance just to the coal industry. And we know that coal is bankrupt. The coal companies have already shifted their pension liabilities to the public. Coal miners who make $80,000 a year and don't want to give up that work, and we have to find them new work, I get that. They still have a life expectancy in their 40s. These are not good jobs, and it is no way for us to enter the future. But we actually can fix banking if we get together. We can take back our power of choice. We can align our banking with our values. We can insist that regulators canonize in regulations non-financial performance metrics. That's one of the things we're very busily working on. I'll talk more about that in a little bit. And we can ask the regional banks in our system, out of sheer enlightened self-interest, to migrate deposit, equity, and human capital to their balance sheet when they take up behaviors that we can be proud of. So we're relying on a theory of change to change the banking system for good. So in the first place, and I'm talking to an educated audience, so forgive me if I'm repeating what you already know, but it is important to recognize why banking is so powerful and why it is quasi-public. Or in my case, I would say it's public, period. So these are the factors that magnify the bank's powers and suggests that it's really our system, it belongs to us. The first is what I mentioned to you, that we really are crowdfunding, but the intermediary banks are not respecting our wishes. The second is that the lending practice is the strongest thing that a bank does, with the exception of the money center banks, which are actually more involved, like hedge funds and PE firms, in trading securities and speculative investments. But that lending practice is super powerful when a bank is run correctly, and lending is a recycling activity. We lend money out, it comes back, we lend it again. So all of the impact associated with those loans accumulates over time. It creates situations, for instance, in the same 3-year period when the city of San Francisco was able to produce 300 units of net affordable housing, we were able to finance 4,600 units of it. So lending is super powerful for the recycling. Banking is very powerful because of its source of funding. We give it FDIC insurance. That's a self-insurance pool, but it is a prerogative that we granted it, knowing that if the insurance fund ever fails, the American taxpayer would stand behind it, and we saw that happen in the meltdown several times. That allows banks to collect deposits very easily and very cheaply. It's the second cheapest source of funding in the economy after securitization. Then we also allow banks to use leverage. In our bank, we have a 10-to-1 capital ratio. So for every $1 of equity that we raise to start the bank, we can add $9 of deposits, roughly speaking, and make a $10 loan. And you know that there's something called the fractional reserve system, so it's a fair bit more complicated than that, but that's the simplification of it. And we have the most conservative leverage ratio in the entire industry. On the eve of its collapse, Bear Stearns was actually levered 33-to-1. So leverage is very powerful as well. Then we may not like what banks are doing, but they have enormous discipline to know what they are doing because of the regulatory regime that they must meet. We actually have about 25 regulatory exams a year, internal and external. The biggest banks are in chronic regulatory review. If you want to know what they're doing, you can find it out if they would just divulge it. It's all being measured. And then scale. The banking system is just massive. It's the biggest industry in the world. It far outdistances oil and gas and other industries that you think of as being massive. I think there's now the top 6 banks represent $9 trillion in assets or something like that. It's just huge. It's worldwide. It gets into every other industry. In 2008, on the eve of the collapse, financial services represented 25% of GDP. If you think about that, that's like a 25% surcharge on everything else, because finance isn't anything concrete. It's just enabling other transactions. And then finally, interdependencies. It's very hard to pull on one string in a bank and have it not pull every other sector of the economy. And if you add the shadow banking system, it gets even more interdependent and huge. So how big are they now? This is just an astounding chart because the top 13 financial giants are all too big to fail. And the biggest ones are not even who you think of when you're thinking about big banks, that being BlackRock and Vanguard. BlackRock, let's talk about BlackRock for just a second. Larry Fink famously challenged all of the portfolio companies of BlackRock to do one good thing. And we wrote an op-ed as the mouse that roared, please keep your stinking one good thing and tell them to stop doing all the bad things. So these are big behemoth institutions. They are just huge in the economy. The shadow banking system is huge as well and growing very rapidly. And they exert obscenely inappropriate influence on all sorts of things, including our election cycles. So these are lobbying dollars by industry. You can see finances just doubles everyone else. And campaign contributions to federal candidates growing rapidly over time. The American Bankers Association PAC is now the 4th largest PAC in the country. So how on earth, with this massive runaway banking system, are we going to ensure that banking is aligned with our values? Because it surely isn't now. So we have to remember that we as consumers have both agency and accountability over our banking. Agency meaning choice, accountability meaning responsibility. So if you are banking with one of these money center banks, you are literally affiliated with all of their activities, none of which are terribly good. I'll show you in a future slide the pittance of their assets they dedicate to the main economy called small business and farm lending. But we need to give ourselves a playbook, a guide, a set of standards to know when a bank is aligned with our values, and then with all due haste, get into a bank that meets those standards, or at least rattle the cage bars at the bank where we are and say, you've got to start acting more like this. So we at Beneficial State Bank and Foundation have open sourced a set of bank standards that I'm going to go through right now that's going to be co-created by advocates and activists and other financial institutions, regulators, et cetera, so we can start to have a common understanding in our society of what good banking looks like. The first is governance. We need governance that's aligned with a multi-stakeholder model. I completely reject the Milton Friedman theory that the only duty of the corporation is to maximize shareholder value. I think it's morally debunked It isn't even economically rational because our stakeholders include no less than our customers, our colleagues, the communities in which we work, the environment upon which we all depend, and the public interest at large. That may be special because we are a quasi-public institution called a bank, but I would argue that's the responsibility of every corporation. And if the ownership structure doesn't align with those stakeholders to optimize for all of them, and instead aligns with maximizing shareholder value, you get all sorts of poor outcomes in terms of society. You get audacious rule breaking, you get rule changing, and you get federal bailouts that leave the equity shareholder completely scot-free because they have made sure that their lobbyists have padded the regulatory scheme so that they're held harmless. At Beneficial State Bank, we have an unusually aligned ownership structure. 100% of our economic rights actually belong to Beneficial State Foundation, which is a public charity foundation. Public charities are permanently governed in the public interest. They can't be controlled by a private individual. Tom Steyer and I are on the board, but we can never be a majority of the board. The rest of the board is appointed by Bridge Housing, which represents everyone's right to safe and affordable housing, by the Tides Foundation, which represents every community's right to economic development, and formerly the East Bay College Fund, which was a representation of everybody's right to free and higher education. So at the end of the day, this also means that when profits are distributed from the bank, which would happen through the dividend process, they can only go to Beneficial State Foundation, and their bylaws mandate that profits must be reinvested in the low-income communities that we serve or the environment upon which we depend, or both. That creates a virtuous profit-taking cycle on the other end of the banking process, the beginning of which is that crowdfunding. It literally shores up our borrowing community as well. So the next standard is around lending and investment practices. What I said before is true, that the first thing we need the banks to do in their lending and investment practices is to stop creating harm. But when they get that organized, then we need to move to a platform of approach to lending which represents benefit to all and harm to none. So eliminate the harm, but then start creating some benefits for society. In our case at Beneficial State Bank, we have pledged that 75% of our loans at all times will be in a new economy, meaning an economy that's fully inclusive, racially and gender just, and environmentally restorative. Not neutral, but restorative, because we have to rebuild our natural commons. The other 25% can't be doing anything harmful to our triple bottom line of social justice, environmental well-being, and financial sustainability. If you think about it, if you flip that ratio, we'd be reinforcing the status quo economy, which is not serving us in any means, not in any means. So we have to move rapidly to this new economy, and it means that a preponderance of our lending should be supporting a migration to that. Our investment practice is an exact mirror to that, but we don't do a lot of investing. Wait till you see how much the banks do, the money center banks do. So that produces a need to actually measure where are the loan dollars falling and how can we classify them as being in the new economy. I'm sorry, these are a little small to see, but the first points we give is if the loan is producing something that society desperately needs, like affordable housing or renewable energy. The second is the borrower also aligned in the public interest? Are they a worker cooperative or a B corporation? And the third is, are they simply economic voices that have been precluded from the economy, and that's why it's so unjust? Women and minority-owned businesses, low-income communities, nonprofits, government, etc. So we count up all those loan dollars on the commercial side, and then we also on the consumer side, since we serve both commercial and nonprofit organizations and individuals. Those consumer loans also have to be in the public interest. So we have a high road auto lending practice, for instance. Auto lending is full of predatory practices. It's just the area of great shenanigans by all the banks and the dealers and everybody else. It's arguably worse than payday lending. We have a high road auto loan product that's properly underwritten, that allows people to improve their credit scores, that gets them into largely used cars. These are pre-prime borrowers for the most part. People still need cars in this society to get to work and pick up their kids from school. Until we get mass transit, we have to be engaged in the auto economy as well. But we have in addition to our normal auto product, we are part of the Clean Vehicle Assistance Program. So we are allowed to make grants, care of the California Air Resource Board, for low-income individuals to get into hybrids and electric vehicles and to subsidize their electric charging costs as well. We also do individual development accounts, which is a tax-preferred way for people to save with accelerated matching toward goals like buying a home, starting a business, continuing your education. So personal lending has also got to be completely aligned in the public interest. Then we also want to be sure that banks, in addition to their lending practice, have products that have mission at the heart of them. So all banking products should make a person or an organization healthier the day after they took them than they were the day before. Certainly should not be undermining their financial health and well-being. So we make sure that all our products are fair and transparent, that they empower businesses and nonprofit organizations, and they're mission-driven. Just one example. You might have heard that a lot of the consumer abuse came about through overdraft practices. Every bank in the system processed checks from the largest to the smallest, because if you put the largest check in first, you're going to maximize the number of potential overdrafts on a day. They charge really high rates for them, $36 to $45 per overdraft, and they don't limit how many happen in a day. Then they notify their clients that their overdraft through snail mail that goes through Denver. So you might get a notice 10 days later that you've been overdrawn. In our bank, we call people as soon as they're overdrafted. We charge much lower rates. We have to charge something because there's moral hazard if you don't. But we limit the number that they can get in a day. I think it's 3 per day for an individual at $10 a piece. And we're trying to get them out of overdraft as rapidly as we can. And if we have a client that's chronically in overdraft, we work with them because they're not ready for banking if that's what's happening. It's not good for them. It's not good for us. Okay, so that's ownership, lending and investment practice, deposit and transactional products. The fourth area is that we practice radical transparency in all other corporate practices. So there's many things a bank does that never actually affects the consumer or the borrower, but they matter just as much. I mentioned before that 1/3 of bank tellers are on some form of public assistance. So in our case, we have a beneficial employment practice where we pay 150% of living wage fully benefited in all markets as determined by the MIT living wage calculator. This allows people at 150%, that's what's considered necessary for one adult with a dependent living in home with them to live, not just to work, but to actually live. So we are paying our people to live. We are also monitoring our carbon, landfill, and water footprint and driving those down every year per FTE. We are green certified in every jurisdiction that has that opportunity. We also submit to a tremendous number of third-party audits to make sure that we're showing up as a good corporate citizen. We're a B corporation. If you know, those are about 4,700 companies worldwide now that have put their shareholders on notice that they are not maximizing shareholder profit. They're optimizing for social and environmental goals as well. We are the third highest ranking B corporation in the United States. We don't do that to puff our chest out and brag. We're doing that to hold ourselves accountable. We need those third-party assessments. A number of other certifications, including the Community Development Financial Institution certification by Treasury, which is essentially having 60% of your loans in low to moderate income census tracts. Let me just go back. So that's area number 4. 5, responsible advocacy. So you saw that the biggest banks in the system are playing a heavy lobbying game. And I can tell you they are not doing it with your interests or society's interests in mind. They are simply trying to game the rules for their own benefit and profit. We will not support any advocacy that is not aligned in the public interest. And that actually puts us at odds with most of the banking associations, so we don't belong to them for the most part. We do belong to the Community Development Bankers Association. We're still by far the most progressive bank, so sometimes we even split from them and write our own letters to Treasury about CRA reform or CDFI funding or things like that. And then lastly, just broad transparency. We should know a lot more about what these banks are doing and what they're not doing. We're only getting told what they want us to hear through CRA publications and full-page ads in the New York Times and billboards and everything else. We give away the equivalent of 5 to 10% of our profit every year because that's our responsibility through sponsorships and community. None of the biggest banks in the country come close to 1% of their profits in terms of what they give back, in spite of all those fancy advertisements. All right. Now, I think we're going to get to some. Oh, so also, it is our pledge to put more different and younger people in charge as rapidly as we can. We have a diverse management team, a very diverse board. We track our human capital statistics. It is time for this country, for the power leadership in this country to reflect how the country actually works, looks, and that's how we work as well. And we join other allies for strength, both those within our family and those outside. I mentioned the Community Development Bankers Association, but we're also on the board of and members of the Global Alliance for Banking on Values. That's now about 54 banks internationally who all have alignment like we do. Because together we can be voices for change. We have to have a theory of change that is robust, because we know at $1 billion in assets, we are not somehow going to become the main banking system. And we've actually really refined this over the 11 years of our existence to try to pull every lever we possibly can. We certainly are trying to influence more banks to take up our practices as an enlightened, self-interested way to migrate deposit, equity, and human capital to their needs. So we saw in the Dakota Access Pipeline, the activists of that movement were very alive to the power of banking, and they called upon people to divest from banks that had financed that pipeline. $100 million of deposits fled those banks in the first 4 weeks. So we know that there is pressure out there on depositors to move when something big like that happens. And we see some of the intermediary banks, the regional banks like Bank of the West just announced that they're divesting from fossil fuels and paying all their employees $15 an hour. We actually think that's a positive sign. It's not that they're not out to make money. They just think that they can do a better job of it if they align a bit better with their depositors' values. Equity capital, we have the divest invest movement of the big national foundations trying to get them to divest from fossil fuels and private prisons and payday lending, and more importantly, to invest into pro-social, pro-environmental companies. Banks would be an awesome objective of their investment refocus. And then we need to help our regulators come to see that they should regulate for much more than simply safety and soundness. They already do. If you think about what banks' regulatory regime is, it goes well beyond safety and soundness. We have fair lending responsibility, not to discriminate in lending practices. We have anti-money laundering, not to allow illicit capital and cash to flow through our economy. We are responsible to stop cybersecurity. We are responsible for protecting customers' information and privacy. We really are an arm of law enforcement, if you think about it, and we have to embrace those duties as our regulators do, but we should be pressing for many more affirmative regulatory responsibilities along those 6 areas of other responsibilities that I just described. So where are we in all of this? Well, once again, the world is swimming in debt. The yield curve just inverted, and I believe stayed inverted since last Friday, which is the strongest predictor of a recession. This time around, it's not only mortgage debt, which is still clear and presently with us. There is a tremendous amount of consumer debt. particularly a really scary debt overhang in student loans. I think there's 1.6 trillion of student loans, 1 trillion of which is held by the Department of Education. It's no way to finance our future, which is what our young people are. And we are real estate heavy in all the banks still. This is the household debt. So that red line there is that scary student loan debt. But we're also still going to be plagued by credit card debt, mortgage debt, home equity lines, et cetera. We just are carrying a huge amount of debt. This is leverage by industry. So not only are we as a society carrying a lot of debt, our banks are carrying a lot of debt. They are super, super leveraged. They're the biggest black line there. And we have to wonder, while we're carrying a lot of risk going into a recession, but from a society standpoint, from the size and the leverage of the biggest banks, we have to ask ourselves also, while they're threatening the economy once again, what is the actual business that they're doing? Where are they actually lending? What kind of assets are they holding? Well, so this is what I promise you. Sorry, this is part of the Debbie Downer slide of before, but the 33 major global banks poured $1.9 trillion into fossil fuels since the Paris Agreement. That was our national commitment to contribute to climate change reduction, and the banks are leaning stronger into fossil fuel financing. It's increased every year since Paris. So in spite of them showing up at Paris and saying, we're going to lend $2 billion into renewable energy, remember I told you that $4 billion means nothing to them? A $2 billion commitment to renewable energy is, you could lose that in your pocket. You know, it's just a ridiculously small amount of money. So instead, they now the 6 biggest banks account for 37% of fossil fuel financing, and JP Morgan Chase leads the pack, $67 billion in finance for fossil fuels over the past 3 years alone. And in a time when Jamie Dimon is on the airwaves saying, what's all this I hear about climate change? Incredibly duplicitous activities of the banks. In addition to financing fossil fuels, they're actually huge into speculative investments and trading in their own accounts. Volcker rule and GlassSteagall is not alive and well. We have not done a good job of re-regulating them out of that. We have not kept their leverage down because even though they have new capital requirements and stress testing and everything, we're simply not enforcing it. They're failing these tests and we're not doing anything about it. They have a financial first and only agenda, and they don't care if that literally burns the U.S. economy down. And while they're doing this, they're actually depriving the main economy of the low-cost deposit funding that they soak up. There's $13 trillion of deposits in the American economy alone, and most of it is in those big money center banks. So our crowdfunding is literally going to speculative trading assets and fossil fuel investments instead of into small business lending and the Main Street economy. So this is just one example of the biggest bank in the system. Actually, I think one of the European banks is bigger, but the biggest bank in America is JP Morgan Chase. This is 2 depictions of their assets according to US GAAP accounting and then according to European standards of accounting. Either measure, they're massive, but look at the market equity they have. Everything else is debt. It's either debt from depositors or debt from other sources. These are, this is, I'm trying to think. These are all several more measures of how much of banks' assets are in speculative assets and trading securities, not in lending. So what does this mean for us if that's the way the banks are acting? It means we are not crowdfunding. We are financing climate disaster and social inequity. We are not supporting Main Street America and the real economy, and we are carrying way too much risk to be going in and threatening another deep meltdown and very volatile economic cycles. Now, one thing I think about all the time is how are we going to constrain these banks? And we have to be thinking of some pretty bold agendas in order to do that, because they're already outrunning way ahead of us, and they are massive, and it's hard to get our arms around them at all. And as we saw in the last financial meltdown, they're so big, they're too big to fail, and so they must be bailed out, and then we protect the shareholders at our own expense. In addition, they carry with them enormous counterparty risk, which is why AIG had to be bailed out and Goldman Sachs had to be bailed out. And they're not doing their job. So what could we do about this? So first of all, we propose 4 simple rules of re-regulation, and we should not waste the next crisis, but actually get out there and say, DoddFrank wasn't enough. Let's have these 4 simple rules. They are, we should return to a Volcker Act or a GlassSteagall environment where there's no equity risk imposed on deposit capital. We should limit the size of these big banks. It could pick your number. It has to end in $1 billion, not in $1 trillion, and they should have living wills to break themselves up well in ahead of reaching that. I require every one of them to carry a 10% Tier 1 capital buffer at all times and implement countercyclical capital rules so they actually add capital during the good times. What happens in these cycles when they're operating on really thin capital buffers is we go into the downturn and the regulators impose on them higher capital ratios. They can't raise capital in a downturn at prices that their equity shareholders will accept. So what do? They contract. They withdraw all their lines of credit. It's breathtaking to watch. They pull all their lines of credit from big corporations and other kinds of companies. Those companies just slow down all of a sudden, and the main economy takes up the brunt of that. There's nothing going on below that. We watch this like just a standstill. Just they stop the economy because they stop lending. So make them have high capital buffers to begin with and layer on capital during the good times, and then let them fail. Every single one of them, let them fail. No bank bailouts. I don't even care if it's a much beloved community bank. They all have to fail. That's the only way the equity shareholder accepts the appropriate amount of risk and therefore hires the appropriate management. We have an adverse natural selection going on in bank management right now because equity shareholders are so greedy to get their return, they will hire the person who is literally most willing to do the worst stuff. That's how that competition goes. So re-regulate with the 4 simple rules, empower consumers to know how their banking is or is not serving them and to vote with their money by changing banks. I think we should consider revoking FDIC insurance from the money center banks right now. They are not acting in ways that observe the implicit covenants of self-insurance. They're putting all the rest of us at risk. For the regulators, the FDIC or other prudential regulators to do it would require some pretty fancy statutory footwork. But I think we should think about organizing all the rest of the banks in the system. And now there are only 6,000 of us. There were 12,000 banks in 2008, and there's 6,000 of us now. There's only 11 money center banks. All the rest of us should get together and say, kick them out. We're not going to insure you. You cannot be part of this insurance pool unless you decide to carve out a bank that's actually lending to Main Street economy. Then come on in. If we did that, that would return $13 trillion of deposits to the main banking system. All those employees who were working for those money center banks could come work for the community banks and the credit unions who now have big deposit bases and can lend much more money into the main economy. This would be a de facto reinstatement of the Volcker Act or the GlassSteagall Act, but do it in a really strong enforcement way. So we also need to preserve the DoddFrank. As I mentioned, we're not enforcing it right now. That which is not enforced ceases to exist. We work hard every day to prevent deregulation and to support the principles of DoddFrank. We should come up with some sort of way of policing the banks on their employment practices because they are literally driving poverty in our society. We need strong protection for consumers. I'm going to talk about the possibility of a state consumer protection agency. And we should have some guardrails on them for not destroying our planet. If we got those $13 trillion of deposits back into the community banks and the banking system, we would be restoring funding for small business economy, which is the lion's share of job creation. That's where good jobs come from. They come from small business. We would be de-risking the banking system, making it more resilient to go through the economic cycles, and we would soften those economic cycles. They don't need to have such big peaks and low troughs. And moreover, if we kick them out, then they got to compete with the real hedge fund and the real private equity interests that don't have deposit funding as a subsidy. That is the way we could build something beautiful. Because when we come together, there's no limit to what we can get done. We just have to not care who gets the credit. If we all come together, we could take back this banking system and literally swing $13 trillion of deposits. I'm going to stop there. I think I had promised in like the verbiage to talk about the food system and ranching, and I'm really happy to do that, but I'm aware that I've been monologuing now for some time. So I think I'd rather take some questions. And to launch some questions, I wanted to say that you're among the first to know that we are part of a coalition trying to establish a consumer protection agency at the state level in California. California is the 5th largest economy in the world. If you get consumer protection right in California, the banks will build products that meet California standards everywhere else they go. It's a lot like the CAFE standards. The automakers don't make a different car for Ohio than they make for California. The governor is wildly excited by this. Assemblywoman Limon has proposed a bill to introduce a CFPB. She's adorning it with some other supporting bills like a rate cap on payday lending. We have Rich Cordray, the former head of the Federal Consumer Finance Protection Bureau, on retainer to advise, along with Seth Frotman, the nation's leading expert on student loan debt. The DBO has just got their new appointee, Manny Alvarez, who comes out of the Consumer Finance Protection Bureau by background. He is a lawyer by training. He is an advocate. We adhere to the Twin Peaks theory of regulation, which is that the prudential regulators, concerned as they must be with the safety and soundness of banking, should not be the same regulator for consumer protection. They have an inherent conflict of interest because there's often things you can do to improve the profitability of a bank that's directly harmful to consumers. So Twin Peaks meaning there are 2 regulatory authorities, one for safety and soundness, one for consumer protection. We have an opportunity to actually expand the authorities of the CFPB in a state version of it. It wouldn't be called the CFPB, but let's just call it state protection, consumer protection. The statutory authorities for CFPB was to protect seniors, military service personnel, students, and anyone affected by fair lending, meaning mostly people of color. This agency could also protect new Americans, rural Americans, you name it. It's high time we did this. We are home to Wells Fargo, which has been in the headlines the most for consumer abuse of late, and they can't seem to find their way out of that quagmire, no matter how many new CEOs they appoint. If we can return justice to consumers, we also give them back a lot of money, and we get a healthier society because they're not hemorrhaging money into the banking system. When Washington Mutual offered free checking, it cost on average every customer $500 a year in fees and penalties. So if you want to, I'm going to figure out a way with Josh and Ted to keep you apprised of the progress on this, but I think it will move pretty quickly, and it will put California in the forefront of consumer protection nationwide and inspire other states, perhaps Washington, Oregon, Ohio, Michigan, New Jersey, New York, to establish their own, so there might one day be a federation of consumer protection agencies. I know some of you may end up in this field, so I hope you are honing your legal skills on behalf of consumers the country over and will join us in this fight. Yes?
Thank you for the super interesting presentation and for just giving us a survey of what the beneficial state bank is about. My own mother is a bank teacher and about how much banks are well paid and the instability that like local community banks face against big banks has really reflected both my experience and my family's experience. So I really appreciated that. So I just have a couple of questions.
Mm-hmm.
and everyone else should do the same. My second question is, I guess it's a question of like corporate governance and like democratic or membership participation. To what extent does ESB like involve its members in the decisions that the bank makes with what to do with their money?
Mm-hmm.
And I guess another alternative model I've seen is like just having like a city-run bank or a state-run bank.
Mm-hmm.
Right? So what overlap is there between, like, let's say that model of banking and ESB, and where are the areas in which you're different, where there are disadvantages and advantages for
Mm-hmm.
ESB
Mm-hmm.
let's say like a state-run bank?
Yeah, yeah, great. Wonderful. You just like filled out a whole other deck. So, and can you still hear me because I changed the, okay. So we have strenuous conversations on mission principles every single day in the bank, and we publish those as well. Principles about lending and about product construction. So just this morning, across my desk comes, we need to have a conversation about landfill RNG. So should we be involved in the business of landfills that are trying to come into the modern century? And what are the principles that we need to observe in doing that? So do they have to be really good at containment and repurposing of landfill waste? Or do they also have to be really good at diversion, meaning like recycling and composting at the front end? Like that's the level of detail that we get into. And we have super big arguments about it. Actually, banking is super interesting because we are involved in every aspect of the economy. And you get to be trained by an expert, the borrower, in that field at least a little bit. So yes, we do have mission principles. We do publish on them. We don't assign a rating per se. We should get to that because we have scarce capital. So we can't finance everything, and we should have some prioritization. What we've done in the first 10 years of our growth is just try to build out a scaled bank that is all things to all people. So for instance, in our early years, we were meant to be half commercial bank, half mortgage lender. So we could be commercial and consumer. But we were born on June 27, 2007, and you know what happened after that. There wasn't a homeowner left standing, so we couldn't be a mortgage lender. We worked really hard to build up a big multifamily lending practice. That's a super important product for us. So think small apartment buildings. 82% of the residents of whom are low to moderate income individuals or households. Very important stock of housing in America. It's actually the go-to stock of housing for most people of low resources. And it's potentially in future a perfect platform for energy retrofit and generation to contribute to a low carbon economy. So it has a really high priority for us for a number of reasons. One, it gets us into the housing need that has been a crisis in every era of our existence, from foreclosure to gentrification and displacement. It has that climate aspect to it. We're always trying to unite social justice and environmental well-being. They're two sides of the same coin. And it is filling a real need, particularly in downturns. Those are Class B properties. They do well in downturns, and their residents do better too. So we would give that a high rating, but we also feel like we need to be part of true consumer markets. So we actually bought an auto lender to get into consumer markets. Since we couldn't be a mortgage lender, which would have been our biggest consumer market, we went into auto loans because they're like a gateway product into banking. A lot of people have no other relationship with a bank other than their auto loan. And we felt we could clean up there a lot of the bad practices and set an exemplary product model that we could license then to somebody else. So it has a lot of high priority for us because it's serving, again, a very basic need. It's cleaning up bad practices, and it's scalable through licensing. We're not going to grow our balance sheet ever bigger. And, that's just not in our fate, nor is it in our principles because we don't believe in really big banks. We haven't gotten to rating for other banks because we're like a push me, pull you beast. We have to, growing a bank balance sheet is really a balancing exercise all the time. You have to have enough deposit funding for the loan practice. You want the composition of your loan practice to be good from a risk rating standpoint so that they're not all correlated, et cetera. So where I do think we're going to get into rating is in the bank standards. That there's a lot of different recipes for a good bank that's addressing the main needs of society, cleaning up bad practice, and scaling in some sense. You could do that a lot of different ways, but those six areas of activity, governance, lending, transactional products, corporate practices, etc., those are super important, and those should yield ratings over time. So the reason we're open sourcing is we want to make sure that it's a set of standards that has broad buy-in and acceptance and input, and so that we can get to a place where people agree, yeah, if you get rated on these standards, we think those are legitimate. Then you asked about input in the governance process. So we have a long-term plan to diversify our governance as well. So we would like one day to have employee representation on our board. We looked into an ESOP. Unfortunately, ESOPs drive you towards some counterproductive ends. Like once you have under ERISA law, the fiduciary duty of the plan manager is to maximize the value of the asset. So they could end up selling us to B of A or something like that. So now we're looking at some other unique models of heavy profit sharing and almost like a union bargaining unit shop steward, so that our white and blue collar rank and file can have some contribution to governance. It also gets a little tricky because there's personal liability on a bank board. So we want to immunize people who don't have financial resiliency from that, but still have their input. We switched core platform providers. There's an oligopoly of core platform providers. That's the payment rails within your bank that everything runs on. There's 3 main providers, and they act like an oligopoly. So we got.
The Wall Street Journal did a story on recently, right? Like they have like a monopoly, like
Yeah.
banks can't afford to.
Yeah. Yep. I think our provider actually now makes more money on contract cancellation penalties than on customer origination. So yeah, they got us in there. So we broke up with them. It was expensive. We went to a more bespoke core platform so that we could have more advanced technology to do, among other things, user-driven design. So when you use a financial product, you probably have an insight every time you use it. Like, I wish it did that. I wish it didn't do that. Boy, what if it could help me do this, that kind of thing. So we want to try to get that kind of input. We get the proxy of that in the massive amount of innovation going on in FinTech. So some people think banks and FinTechs are competitors. We don't actually think of it that way. Like, we can't innovate as agilely as a FinTech can because of our regulatory burden, and it's just a mindset too. They can innovate quickly, but they can't scale because they're all living off a hedge fund debt at 15% minimum, something. So they kind of need us and we need them, and we try to work with them responsibly everywhere we can because they have a lot more of a promise of getting user-driven design or even community-driven design. We also participate in a huge number of advocacy groups and activist movements and so on to get the people's voice, like what do they hate about banking, what do they wish it could do, that kind of thing. We love the idea of public banks. I participated in the City and County of San Francisco's working task force on municipal banking, which came out in favor of establishing a municipal bank. We've studied a lot of the North Dakota bank version and what they could be. You know, Ben Franklin wanted the post office to be a public bank, basically. We think it's actually a really essential component of the banking system because it has accountability to the public. I personally think it would have to exist at the state level to have the capital strength and diversification and liquidity that it would need. We have a quasi-public bank right now called the Infrastructure Bank that could be, their authorities could be expanded, and maybe they could also bank California employees and have a source of deposits, which they don't currently have, but they do large infrastructure, renewable energy, the things we really need to dedicate public deposits to. They downstream capital to the community banks and credit unions to lend to business. I don't favor a public bank doing actual commercial lending because I think it takes a bank actor in the system to get the underwriting right, and to be locally proximate, kind of thing. But that's a really good role that they play. So we're pushing on that. We're part of the Public Banking Alliance and participating in all those conversations and hoping that we get one launched here in the state of California. I think the same states that are looking at a state consumer protection regulatory authority are also eager to look at public banking, and they could sort of grow up together. If we had a federation of public banks, it would be super interesting. I will say one thing, sorry to talk so long. North Dakota Bank ran into a conundrum, which is that by their 105-year-old charter, they're obliged to finance any municipality, no matter what they're doing. So they ended up having to finance the municipality that hired the draconian security forces that trampled on the rights of the protesters at DAPL. And that was just a tragedy, right? Like there wasn't anything they could. So I favor a public bank at the state level that has divisional banks that have local boards that can hold them accountable, and then a set of access rights, like they can come up for capital or liquidity, but they can also veto another municipality's actions that they think are unjust. Thanks for those questions. Yes. Military, yeah. Yes. Yeah. That's good to hear. Yeah. Yeah. No, great. So honestly, we stumbled into our ownership model because Tom and I didn't want to profit from a bank that was working in low-income communities or even appear to. So instantaneous to the creation, we both capitalized and gave the economic rights away, like from the first second. We kept the voting rights because we wanted to make sure it stayed on mission. But over time, we want to devolve those voting rights to that diversification of the governance. So be able to give the employees through a shop steward or something like that, representation on the board, and an actual, maybe potentially an ownership of the voting rights in the bank to canonize that seat. Similarly, we're out raising new capital for the first time, only from nonprofits or charitable vehicles. And in order to get the first capital in, we promised some of the voting rights, diversifying our governance from bench strength as well. So this is a prominent venture capitalist who wanted to invest through his charitable vehicle because he cares about business formation in immigrant communities. Perfect, great. We need that voice on the board. So we gave him a modicum of the voting rights. Large community foundations would be perfect investors for us because they have this financial sophistication. They have probably a CFO who could sit on the board and take that kind of fiduciary responsibility. And so we want to have some of that voting rights in hand to sell to them if they invest in the bank. So over time, we will give that away, probably not below 51%, until it's time to literally hand it off to its stewards, and Tom and I go away. But that was the reason. Sure. Yes.
I think one more question.
Okay. Yeah. So we have a terrible problem of money in politics, as everybody here knows, and the federal government is literally paralyzed by it. So I don't actually expect Democrats any more than Republicans to come out against the biggest banks. The biggest banks own a lot of people. People are scared of the Koch brothers. They're scared of the banks. They're scared of oil and gas. We're getting an awful lot of political representation that's not allegiant to the people. So I think in the end, it's the people who are going to take back banking. We are using this moment in time, a Camelot moment in California. Politics are not perfect here. We got a lot of problems in this state, but it's more of a functioning democracy than is true at the federal level. And we have a few more politicians who are not owned and are willing to be brave on some of these issues. But it would have to sort of catch fire from there and be a groundswell of people insisting on this, like we're not going to get screwed by the banks again. We got to re-regulate the banks. I hope that somebody someday gets money out of politics through true campaign finance reform, meaning everybody's limited to a public budget. Nobody uses their personal funds to run. Just get money out of politics. I actually think Tom Steyer is one of the few people in the world who could get that done. And every time he's looking for something new to do, I say, why don't you take that one on next? But at the moment, notwithstanding the significant problems that will still remain at the federal level from captive politicians, I think we're pretty focused on a change of administration because we are normalizing some really lawless behavior that's going to be hard to reel back from. So that's why I, without any manners, mention need to impeach everywhere I go. Yeah. Oh, yes. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Yeah, you know, I'm 2/3 of the way through Winners Take All, which I highly recommend. And Anand talks about Michael Porter, who is kind of symbolic with American Business School, like he is the guy. And he was inner city investors, saying, I think we've made a terrible mistake. I think we're running corporate America badly, and it's influencing everything, which I really commend him on, because otherwise, sorry, but Harvard Business School is sort of the heart of darkness right now in terms of what it's produced. I did go to Stanford, so, and they're really conservative too. But anyway, I think we need business voices to say it's time to reform corporate America. We've had a corporate takeover of politics in America, and it's just killing us. But I'll look into that. I didn't know there was an actual. Yeah. Yeah. It's the blessed unrest, all sorts of things happening.
All right,
thanks.
So much.
Thank you.
All right. We have a great pizza giveaway.